Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the panel documenting the Topaz experience. My name is Kimberly M. I'm a professor at the University of Utah, just recently hired in the Department of Theater and Ethnic Studies, and I was asked to just come and help the panel progress. We have 3 speakers today, and I will go ahead and introduce everyone, and then we will just begin. We did have a scheduling change in that Jane Beckwith, who is presenting A Founder's View, Topaz Museum, would like to go first today. So that's a change in the schedule. Jane Beckwith is, as I said, presenting A Founder's View, Topaz Museum. She was originally a high school English teacher for many years and then began a project on the Topaz Museum, on Topaz I should say, and was a founder of the Topaz Museum and is currently the president of the institution. Scotti Hill will be presenting When Words Weren't Enough, Curating the Topaz Museum's Inaugural Art Exhibition. And Scotti is an art historian and critic for the Deseret News. And Christian Heimburger is presenting We Have Come to Understand Them, and We Admit We Need Them, Japanese American Laborers in the Interior West, 1942 to 1944. And Christian has his doctorate from the University of Colorado in history, where he specialized in modern U.S. history. And he is currently a historian working on the Joseph Smith Papers project at the LDS Library. So without any further ado, Jane will begin. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering if we would have many in the audience, so thank you. I'll put in a little plug. Delta is 126 miles from Salt Lake. It's not too far to drive. You could come to the museum and have a nice day, and you could have a elk burger someplace if you talk to me afterwards if you need a place to stay. In 1982, Delta High School had a huge influx of kids coming with their parents. They were helping build the Intermountain Power Plant. And we had so many people coming. Some of them had lived in Saudi Arabia. They'd lived in the Philippines. They'd lived every place. I know you won't believe this, but they said, we don't like Delta very much. And they were really down on it, and they were really terrible about it. And they would be very vocal in class, and they'd say, like, anybody who lives here by choice must be an idiot. And it was like, oh, gosh, I'm here by choice. It was, hey, Robert, come on in. Oh, well, unless you don't want to. My students were kind of bifurcated. The kids that moved in were over here, and the kids that grew up in Delta were over here, and they interacted a little bit, but not very much. And then I had so many kids in the class that I couldn't find enough articles for them to do, and so I'd look up, and Randy Smith had his hand on some girl's knee, and it was like, oh man, I can't do this. So I just, a teacher, if you're having problems with discipline, you just make them work harder, that's all. And so I just made them go out into the community and start interviewing people who had worked out at Topaz. There was no Japanese American community in Delta, and I didn't know anyone who had been in Topaz. That was in 1982, so Leonard Arrington's honor lecture to Utah State called The Price of Prejudice, that was available. Mine Okubo's book, Citizen 13660, was available. Years of Infamy was available, and that was really about it. But let's see, I just didn't have a chance to find Yoshiko Uchida's book, Desert Exile, which, by the way, is being sold out there. Go buy it. It's great. And so it was a very unusual class. Have any of you taught high school? Okay. You will not believe me, but people ran to my class. students ran down the hall to my class. I had to tell them, don't hit anybody when you're running down the hall. But they wanted to come in and say, you won't believe what I found out last night. And they'd say, my dad worked out there, this. And they all wanted to be the first in line to be able to tell me. And so really what happened is my students were teaching me. I didn't know that Kyla Overson's dad helped work there before he went in the Navy. I didn't know this. They were teaching me. I would read at night, and I would come back and tell them history that I found out. And then they started talking with each other. I think Randy Smith is still grabbing girls' knees, but it was out of my hands at that point. So we started, when we did that, 1983, people in Delta started talking about Topaz. I grew up in Delta, and frankly, hardly anybody talked about Topaz, except they would say something like this. They'd say, "Oh, Topaz, that's where that guy was shot. Ooh, yeah. Well, you know, he couldn't speak English." And as an 11-year-old, I was thinking, oh, okay. And they'd say, oh, no, he was walking his dog. His dog went through the fence. And somebody else would say, no, I think the wind was blowing and he couldn't hear the warnings. And others would say, you know, he saw a little rock over there that was so beautiful that he wanted to pick it up and he reached for it. So as an 11-year-old, I'm thinking, I wonder what really happened. I'd like to find that out sometime. I'm still looking, by the way. All we know is that he was shot about a quarter of a mile away, directly through the sternum. We know that the soldier was tried in Fort Douglas, and he was found innocent. Pretty hard to go through a 4-foot barbed wire fence and be shot directly through the sternum. So, you know, just that alone is enough to be to start my students and me on a path of contradictions. The contradiction is that many people thought that Topaz people were Japanese Americans. I'm assuming you know quite a bit about Topaz. I didn't want to go through the entire kind of history, but people said that they were put in camps for their own protection. That's hard to believe when there are guard towers and the guns are pointed in. So those kinds of conflicts, I think the English teacher in me just said, hey, this is a very ripe and very wonderful kind of story. So Delta people hadn't really talked about Topaz very much. My family had, because my father, on October about 12th, 1942, hired a man named Harry Yasuda to work in his newspaper office. And, oh, Leo, you're making a grand entrance. No, we're from Delta. But, yeah, he was 3 blocks away from me when he was big brother to all my friends. So my dad had hired a man to work in his newspaper office. And that man's name was just second nature to us. His name was Harry Yasuda, and I'll tell you, everybody in our family knew exactly who that was when my mom would say, oh, I got a card from Harry Yasuda's wife. And she would talk about Stanley, his little boy, and how cute he was, and how Harry Yasuda would come into my dad's newspaper office on Monday morning. That would be a 16-mile trip from Topaz, and he slept in the Chronicle office on a cot. And my dad my mom said that he would go down and buy a loaf of bread, some bologna and cheese, and that was what he ate. Or he would go to the restaurant in town. So when people said, oh yeah, that was a prison camp, they couldn't get out, then I knew this other part of the history that seemed conflicting. And again, those kind of conflicts have really propelled me for a long time. So later I found out that Harry Yasuda was being paid fair market value for his services at my dad's print shop, but people at Topaz were being paid $14 a month if they were, let's say secretary, $16 a month if they were teachers, $19 a month if they were doctors. But Harry was making full wages that you could in Delta. It probably wasn't much, but and so his family was charged rent at Topaz because he was being paid by my dad. Yeah, I love your face, because it's one of those contradictions that says, you can't do that, right? If you look at the Topaz Times, about the first 7 weeks, it will have an article, and right in the middle of the article, in cap letters, it will say, use the gate, not the fence. Use the gate, not the fence. Which to me means people were using the fence. And what were they doing? Going out and all kinds of things. Anyway, so when people in Delta started talking about Topaz, they started bringing me things that they had saved all those years. A crocheted doily, shell jewelry, books that used to be out at the library at Topaz. Pretty soon, I had one of those big steamer trunks full in my room of just stuff. And I immediately started thinking, how come there isn't a museum about this? There should be a museum. And of course, that's the first kind of inkling. And then as I collect more things, and I start meeting Japanese Americans who have very fascinating stories to tell me. Bob Utsumi was the first man who took me out to Block 13 and walked around with me and said, this is where this was, this is where this was. And this is where we made an ice rink. And they said, well, not too many people had ice skates because they came from the San Francisco Bay Area, but we ordered them through Montgomery Ward. And he said one little guy he was about 10, and he made an ice rink, and he charged people 10 cents to use it. Yeah, a little entrepreneur kind of spirit. So anyway, I was teaching full-time. When my students left that year, I was still interested in the story. Most of them were seniors and they had left. I tried to teach the next year, kind of the same thing, just to kind of carry on. I had a new principal, and he had grown up in San Diego. And one day he called me in. This is 1984, so that makes a big difference to an English teacher. He called me into his office and he said, Mrs. Beckwith, are you an English teacher or are you a history teacher? I said, I'm an English teacher. And he said, then you should stay with English. And he told me that it was not within my scope of teaching to say anything about Topaz, and that I should set it aside. But he also told me that he had grown up in San Diego, and that his background was, he was about 6 during the war, and he was afraid that someone would come and shoot him in the head in the middle of the night. So that kind of wartime hysteria had continued with him for a long time. So there's nothing like somebody telling a Beckwith they can't do something. So we went forward. Anyway, because of that year, we now have this building. Oh, come on. Can I get a little ooh? Yeah. Can I get a little awe? And it opened in January with a really lovely art show, which Scotti was the curator for, and it's really quite fantastic. I'm just going to go through these slides very quickly because I told Brad I was not a PowerPoint princess. Inside, the 2 little display cabinets on the side are shell jewelry made out at Topaz. Because bottom of Lake Bonneville caused sort of like a deposit of shells, people would go from Topaz in trucks out to this deposit, pick up shells in bottles, bring them back. Oh, I got an O. Ah. That little doll is so cute. See her purse, 2 little clam shells. Her toes, her feet are snail shells. And her tulips are shells, her face is shell. And if you lift up her skirt, Randy Smith would do that, you would find a nice slip made out of white crepe paper. So this is what Scotti will be talking with you about a little bit more. We made inside barrack. We have a lot of artifacts from Topaz, but we didn't want to put them in our outside barrack because the conditions are so rugged. So we wanted it to be clean, but that's a contradiction because Topaz itself had so many cracks that people would wet newspaper and shove it in the cracks around the windows. So people will complain about this. We know that they will complain. But in there will be the original artifacts. Can you see the WRA on that mattress? Which of course means W, or War Relocation Authority. The pillows are fake, but the cots are exact. The suitcase that's under that one cot is Mine Okubo's suitcase. She was one of the artists. The chairs were made at Topaz out of a crate that was shipped from Tanforan and then taken back to California because after the camps, people knew that they had nothing, absolutely nothing, and they were starting over. So those didn't come to us until about 1994. The stove is in robust condition, and I'll tell you that was June Reed's stove, and you know why it would be in such robust condition. She taught second grade.
Topaz.
And well, but she was a thoroughly she was my second grade teacher. Yeah. The display or the set of drawers was made out at Topaz. The little box that it's a baseball bat, I don't know if you can see. The man that made the chairs for us said, I'll make you the other furniture that I had there that I didn't bring back. So he said he had a box for his baseball glove and his baseballs and bats. These are szuris that were made from shale out at Antelope Springs. Antelope Springs would be about 40 miles away, and you would have to drive there. People actually did camp out there, and they would bring these pieces of rock back and then make them into, these are called szuris, which is a Japanese inkwell. I don't know if you can see the one on the far left over there has a couple of trilobites, and then this one in the middle has, it's carved with trees, matsu, and it has a cover that's made out of a citrus crate. And then this one on the end is very utilitarian, and when you turn it over on the back, it says WRA Topaz Camp. This is a mochi bowl. I don't have anything to kind of tell you how the size of that, but it weighs about 350 pounds. It took 4 big guys to bring that in from Topaz. This was on block 22. Mochi is made out of a special kind of rice. I don't know where they got the rice from, but we have found about probably 6 mochi bowls out at Topaz. This one was turned over, and so 70 years later, when we turned it back over, it's in really beautiful shape. It's made out of a barrel, and you can see the staves that have been weathered off. They were just kind of sitting by it. Our gallery. Another piece that had been out at Topaz on block 17, we have a nice photograph of this one during camp, taken into Lilac Holman's house and then brought back to us. This is the outside barrack. This is half of a recreation hall that was used for the Boy Scout meeting hall at Topaz. And this is an original. The problem is we have to change the tar paper about every 4 years. It just, 3 minutes. Long. Inside of it, the floor is original. You can see it was the Boy Scout meeting place. So more stoves. Topaz for a short time was called Abraham, but since Abraham had a post office, they had to change the name. This is a step from block 7 with names. It says Pool of Fame in the middle, kind of cool. Oh, I should have brought some of these. People are now bringing back artifacts that they took from Topaz, and they say, you need to have these in the museum. Well, some of the things, we would love to have them out at the site. The Topaz Museum Board has purchased 633 acres of the site. Oh, that should have been another moment. But these came back. No, it's not an oh no, but it's an oh man. That's pretty something. These are about 4 inches around, and we have, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 of them. and their gears made out of wood, we cannot think of what they were used for. And this is stuff that people have scavenged from camp and bring it back to us. This is Topaz, the mile square. This is the only block that we don't own. This guy has told us if we would buy him 6 acres in Park City, he would trade us straight across. That's the kind of work we've been doing. Up here, I'm sure this has a laser pointer someplace, but I don't know where it is. In that corner is the military police, then the hospital, the administration building, and warehouses. And then the blocks 42 to here with the 6 open for recreation. This is the sewer, just going out onto the desert floor with a sewer pumping station right there. And great photograph of the hospital, Drum Mountain, and Block 7. You might check out the water puddles. But that's good because, well, it's good for our history, because the mud was so bad that people made walkways. This is, I should have turned that, but these walkways in between the barracks are still there, and so you can go exactly to this would be block 36, where Mr. Wakasa lived, and you can go exactly to the barrack where he was residing before he was shot. If you fly from Salt Lake to Los Angeles, look out the window, because it's pretty. It's like a brand. The problem is that greasewood has grown up all over it. I don't know, every photograph we take filters that greasewood out. So if you come and want to visit, you almost need a tour. It's hard to negotiate the greasewood. This is really my favorite photograph. This is the co-op man coming into Delta to have a banquet. It looks just a little bit male to me, but you know, my sensibilities is such. So we can recognize faces here. Dave Tatsuno, who took home movies of Topaz. Dwight Uchida, who is Yoshiko Yoshita's father. These men made an incredible business venture at Topaz that they were selling fresh fish at Topaz that came packed in ice on trains. That's incredible. Okay, that's it.
Could I say that most of those buildings came into Delta later? We mentioned the hospital. That was Golden Black and Theo Wicker's home, with a middle section taken out. You can almost trace where those buildings still are, although half of them have fallen apart by now.
So, there you go. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Scotti Hill, and first I'd like to thank the conference, all of its organizers, for putting on this event. I've been excited to come here for a really long time and to hear the other talks and just all of the diversity that we have. And I'd also like to thank Jane, where'd she go? There she is, for the continued commitment that she's had to this project. I know that I would not be here if it were not for her. We'd probably not be in this room in this capacity if it were not for Jane and all of her enthusiasm for this project. And I've learned a lot working with you, so thank you very much. So as our conference organizer stated at the beginning, I'm an art historian and a curator, and one of the questions that I asked the crowd when we had the opening reception down for the art show in January was, do you know what a curator is and what a curator does? So I'm going to ask you that question again. Does anyone know what a curator does? Is anyone willing to give me a description of what that means?
You collect and protect.
I love that. I collect and protect. Yeah, so a curator is essentially an art historian, someone who knows a thing or two about art,
who specializes in making certain decisions about art, about what to keep, what to display, and how best to use that collection to educate people. And so when I first got word of this opportunity, I was extremely excited. And the thing that first came to mind was how strange my knowledge of Topaz was prior to this point. Maybe strange isn't the right word, but the word topaz sort of conjured this weird familiarity in my primary and secondary education, which is to say that that word reminded me of something very disturbing, albeit it was kind of kept in the annals of our social studies classes or our history classes. So when I got the opportunity to mine the collection of this museum, it was like an art historian's dream. If you think about an art historian going into this archive, being able to take artworks out of the bubble wrap, all very safely, of course, but I was in heaven, and I really didn't know what to expect when I first heard that the Topaz Museum had this collection of artworks. So when I made the drive down to Delta, and for me being from Salt Lake City, it felt like a very long drive, and it kind of is, but I was reminded of my privilege, of course, every single time I made that drive, and internally sort of thinking, man, these are dusty roads, this is a long drive. I had to force myself to think of the fact that I could leave at any time, that I wasn't imprisoned, that I knew what my future would be. And that was a really humbling reminder that I constantly tried to keep very close to me. So when I went down to the museum, I was absolutely astonished by the collection. It was more incredible than I could have ever imagined. There's a lot of diversity, and of course that's not surprising because there was a lot of diversity at Topaz. I think one of the mistakes that we worked very hard to avoid is to not make it seem as if it was a monolithic experience. You know, this is what the Topaz experience was, because what we know from the history of Topaz is that there were many generations. That, of course, permanently altered one's perception of being interned there. And as a result, and as you would imagine, the artwork that was reflected by these diverse voices was quite incredible to see. So we wanted to really do service to that, to bring forth that diverse perspective in this art exhibition. And there was also something extra special about it, of course, because this isn't just a regular art exhibition. Those are always very important as an art historian, but there was an added layer here of really paying tribute to something that is so historically important and not taking for granted at all that people already knew about it. So that was a really important thing that I wanted to address. Now, one thing that I think is important to note here, the title of the exhibition is When Words Weren't Enough. And I like that title. It's one that Jane and I had been sort of bouncing back and forth. The title game is a very difficult one, whether it's for a book or an art exhibition. And one of the decisions I made fairly early on is to limit our scope to works on paper. So this is one of those art historical terms that I think a lot of people are curious about. Works on paper, on one hand, is very easy to understand. It's essentially a medium, or many mediums rather, a classification that denotes many mediums on paper. So familiar examples there would be watercolor, woodblock printing, and of course Japanese art history has a fantastic array of those mediums. So what we could have done is we could have taken from other mediums. We had great oil paintings, we had silk paintings, we had artifacts, and with any art exhibition we have to make certain decisions. That's why I'm the curator. So works on paper was really a great way for us not only to tell the individual narratives behind these subjects and showcase much of the artwork that hadn't really been displayed before, but we also use that as an opportunity to educate people on the artistic processes underlying these artworks. And that was sort of fun. We got to explain what woodblock printing was, and this is where we get to our first example of the coyote prints. There are 4 of them here. This is by Hebe. And one of the things that I think was really important here to recognize is that the artists of Topaz did not have an abundance of art materials, especially at the beginning, when photography was prohibited, when there wasn't really an abundance of things to use for art classes or for any one of these artistic experiments. It was really a necessity to have to be creative and resourceful about how you obtained your materials. And that has been an exciting avenue of research, but one that's a little bit difficult to fully master. So the artists of Topaz were often making their artworks with homemade materials. Color cassine, gouache, watercolor, ink, all of these things were at play here, and they all necessitated this scavenging of sorts. And what that tells us is that these artists were absolutely skilled at their trade before they came into the camp, and they were enthusiastic about sharing what they knew with others. There we go. The other thing that I think ties with that point of having to be extra creative about how you obtain your artistic materials is the stylistic diversity that we saw in this collection. And that's something that I really wanted to highlight. Specifically, that when we think about, art exhibitions that are trying to tell a historical narrative, for example, we might instinctively jump to something like this, which is a naturalistic or a didactic approach. In other words, artists like Mine Okubo, and today for our purposes, because I could go on and on for hours, but I've only got a very short 20 minutes, and for Jane's talk that felt like it was 1 minute. So what I'd like to do is kind of narrow it down to just a few artists from the show. But what we have here with Mine Okubo, who was an incredible talent, a young woman who was extremely ambitious prior to the war, throughout her entire life, in fact. But here we have a sense of what life conceivably would have been like in this camp. And we can't take for granted that that information was readily available. Again, because photography and methods for obtaining visual information were in flux. Art played a very integral role of sort of cementing one's own experiences and having a very real desire to actually record what is happening for future generations. So in this case, we can see a work called Man and Boy with Dog. We have here this naturalistic view of how the barracks were arranged in this row. But Mine Okubo is a remarkable case study of an artist who really refused to limit herself, and that's why we have so much of her work in the exhibition, and the museum has quite a bit of her work in the collection, and it was an absolute privilege to see what her offerings were. Now this is another artwork by Mikami, and here's another dog. I didn't notice that there were two dogs. I guess I'm biased towards dogs, but here we have a similar approach, something that is relatively didactic or instructive, but again, made even more impressive by the fact that this is a watercolor painting and that shows the breadth of skill that these artists had. And I think that that's something that visitors have commented on quite frequently when seeing the show is, how impressive their art was, how incredible their skill was. And so what we see on display in many respects are important moments, not just for the personal biographies of the artists, but also for the larger community of Topaz. Here, Mine Okubo shows us the dedication of the Topaz Hospital, actually, recording moments that occurred and trying to sort of voraciously document in visual form so as to not forget, because we know that there was a particular threat of that in this instance. Now going to Mine Okubo again, the museum had many of her artworks, and she is this remarkable example of an artist who took advantage of every opportunity to sketch and to record. Now here we have an ink sketch, and this comes from her famous post-war biography called Citizen 13660. This is one of the iconic Japanese internment pieces of literature, although it hasn't been as recognized as it should. And when we think of something that's a sketch, I think that often gets a bad reputation, or it has sort of this connotation of being something that's very quick, very amateur. But in the case of Mine Okubo, the sketches are really this vital lifeline, this visual journal, if you will, as to what is happening. So Mine, before the war, was an ambitious young art student who graduated from UC Berkeley in 1938. She and her family lived in the Bay Area. She was a second-generation Nikkei Japanese American, and she received a coveted grant to study in Europe after she graduated in 1938. And unfortunately, us history buffs know what 1938 Europe was like. That didn't go so well after a time, and she had to return because of the outbreak of the war in Europe and because of some family issues she had in California. So upon returning, she was first interned at the Tanforan Assembly Center, which was a point of origin for many of the later internees at Topaz. So many of these hastily constructed internment camps, before the official ones, the 10 that spread throughout the United States, were converted from old racetracks, were very dirty, and were not equipped for people to actually live in them. So at the Tanforan Assembly Center, Mine Okubo decided that this was the moment where she would meticulously record what was happening around her. And we have her to thank for many of the insights that we have about that time, specifically for her and for many of the artists at Topaz. So what I think is remarkable about a sketch like this is that it does carry with it something that's useful, visually speaking. In other words, it does carry across the frantic energy of being huddled together in a tight space. What we know of these assembly centers and of the camps is that they were quite uncomfortable, of course. And so in a sketch like this, we can get that very practical, realistic view of what that would have been like, but there's also an accompanying energy to it that I find particularly insightful. We can get a sense of not just the physical chaos, but the emotional chaos as well. And so sketches like this accompanied her journal. So we have two sort of forms that she used to document her reality. An actual sort of written account of what was happening paired with sketches like this. And so we have a number of those in the exhibition right now. I think they're a wonderful companion to some of the other artistic mediums that she worked with while she was at Topaz. And so if we look again at Mine, we can see that she refused to be classified with one artistic medium, with one style. And when I first came across this series, and I'm only showing you one, because hopefully you'll go down to the museum and see some of the others, I was just absolutely enthralled. This artwork really reminds me of European modernism, of the great leaps and bounds that were occurring in her lifetime. And what this signifies to me, probably as an art history geek, but also as someone who loves looking at creativity on display. What this signifies to me is that Mine Okubo, as a very young artist who was placed in the most unfortunate of circumstances, decided to subsume the influences of her surroundings and to really create some of the most breathtaking artworks we've ever seen. And in this case, we have mother and child. The whole series here is a charcoal series. And it really deviates on a scale of emotion. I think it's impossible not to look at this series and be moved by it or intrigued by it in some way. Here we can see that there's a deliberate attempt to incorporate the trends of abstraction while also retaining some very naturalistic renderings of what's happening in the camp. So scenes like this would have been commonplace, and I think it would have perhaps been easier to ignore them. But what Mine Okubo does is confront them outright and use art as a cathartic method, in a sense, of dealing with what is happening and trying to shed some light on how she is personally handling that. And so what we see quite often in her artwork is a blend of abstraction, naturalism, emotion, and then also sort of a documentary eye on what's happening. And if you think about all those things together, that's a lot. So in this case, this was another one of the artworks of hers that I was extremely excited about. I mean, I was excited about it all. But in this case, we have something that is bordering on complete abstraction. This is called Poles and Fences. It's a series of 3 artworks. This is color cassine, which essentially was the creation of pigment by using old milk, curdled milk. So again, it really testifies to the ingenuity and how the knowledge was there at the onset, and it continued throughout the process of internment. So here Mine is incorporating poles and fences, 2 items that are haunting and continual reminders of her imprisonment. And in this case, we can see that color and these abstract planes are used to sort of bring attention to those shapes. And it's an experiment of sorts, thank you, that is quite fascinating to see. Now, of course, there were a number of other artists. I'm not trying to be completely biased towards Mine Okubo. But Chihiro Obata is another one of the standout artists. I consider Chihiro Obata and Mine Okubo to be sort of pillars of the Topaz artistic experience for different reasons, both contributing in their own way to the cultural reality of Topaz during this time. But Chihiro Obata was a first-generation Japanese American. He immigrated in 1903 from Japan, and before the Second World War, he worked as a commercial illustrator. He became known for his gorgeous, expansive views of national parks, specifically in California and Yosemite. And you can see from this work that he created at Topaz that the skill, beauty, and really essence of his craft is immediately apparent. Now for Chihiro Obata, he was as ambitious as Mine Okubo about creating artwork while interned. And importantly, it's worth noting that he was responsible for the creation of the Topaz Art School, which is also a narrative that we really worked hard to incorporate in the exhibition. Many of the internment camps had art schools and had artistic exhibitions throughout the year, and Chihiro Obata was known as being a particularly innovative figure in this regard. The art school that he created actually began at Tanforan, where he and Mine Okubo were interned prior to Topaz, and he transferred it over to Topaz once he was moved there. So I don't know how I'm doing on time. Again, I could go on and on, but perhaps just to give you one last example of Chihiro Obata, this is a wood block print, a very small one, but gorgeous nonetheless. So I'll end there.
Gather some of this art. Most of it's been donated to us, but some we've had to purchase. So if you'd like to make a donation toward that, feel free.
The UCLA collection, what's the status of that?
It's at UCLA.
It's priceless, and you know that. You've borrowed it several times, right?
No, we've never bought it.
Have we?
No.
I thought we had some exhibitions at the Historical Society.
No, it was at
Well, good morning, everybody. On April 15th, 1943, Western Defense Command Lieutenant General John DeWitt testified before the House Naval Affairs Subcommittee in San Francisco. Though summoned to discuss the complex housing and transportation problems facing the Bay Area, DeWitt quickly redirected the conversation towards Japanese American removal. The Supreme Court was preparing to hear oral arguments in 2 cases that challenged the military's curfew and exclusion orders, and DeWitt allegedly parrying constant requests from Japanese Americans hoping to return home. Clearly feeling that he needed to address the issue with members of Congress, DeWitt emphatically told the committee, "I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty." When asked to justify his determined stance, DeWitt declared, "The danger of the Japanese was, and is now, if they are permitted to come back, espionage and sabotage. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still Japanese." When asked whether he made any distinction between Japanese, Italians, and Germans, DeWitt flatly replied, "You needn't worry about the Italians at all except in certain cases, and also the same for the Germans. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map." Now, as bigoted as DeWitt's comments may sound today, his views were hardly extraordinary in 1942. The nation and the American West in particular had a long history of discriminating against people of Asian ancestry. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 seemed to only confirm racial stereotypes and fears that had developed over decades and kicked the anti-Japanese rhetoric into a much higher gear. Racism combined with wartime anxieties ultimately culminated in the wholesale incarceration of all people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast during World War II. The story of Japanese Americans, or I'll refer to them often in this presentation as Nikkei, during World War II has predominantly focused on their forced removal and confinement. This is both understandable and in many ways necessary. While the World War II incarceration camps were secure lockdown facilities, the physical and metaphorical barbed wire fences were more permeable than we might assume. What is often lost in the larger narrative of Japanese American history is the story of tens of thousands of Japanese Americans who temporarily left the incarceration camps to labor in communities throughout the interior West. Working in beet fields, at canneries, and at turkey processing plants, and a host of other industries, these men and women ventured beyond the camps, however temporarily, and contributed significantly to the American war effort. As we are today engaged in a dialogue about documenting the Topaz experience, I submit that we should also consider the experiences of those intrepid men and women who transcended barbed wire. The circumstances that allowed Nikkei laborers to temporarily leave the confinement is one of the lesser-known stories and truly one of the great contradictions of the war. The ironic part of all of this, said Shiro Nomura, was that in the spring of 1942 we had been evicted from our homes and herded into these camps, and 6 months later they were requesting our aid and willing to spread us over a wide area in the western states. Facing an acute manpower shortage just as agricultural production was ramping up, farmers across the interior West pleaded for additional laborers to help them harvest sugar beets, potatoes, fruit, and dozens of other crops, many of which were vital to the war effort. Based on WRA records, I estimate that between 17,000 and 22,000 Japanese Americans, or between 14 to 18% of those incarcerated, temporarily left at one point or another, left the confinement centers to aid in that endeavor between 1942 and 1944. The residents of Topaz also left in significant numbers. In 1942, nearly 8% of the residents left the camp to work on the outside, at least for a short period of time. That number only increased in the succeeding years and was up to about 10% in 1944. The percentage of those who left was even higher in other camps. Minidoka, which is one of the incarceration camps in Idaho, had 26% of its total population leave during one of the years of the war. The Nikkei incarcerated at Topaz worked in a variety of industries. The largest number helped harvest sugar beets, as pictured here, or picked apples, pears, and cherries along the towns of the Wasatch Front. A few went south to help harvest carrots in Iron County. Other Japanese Americans worked in canneries from Ogden to Provo, processing food staple commodities like tomatoes, peaches, and apricots. Some worked in turkey processing plants, like this one in American Fork. Some, like David Hisato, worked odd jobs at places like the Hotel Utah. Harry Yasuda, who Jane mentioned, worked as a typesetter at the Delta-based Miller County Chronicle. Margaret Nakahara and others worked as domestic servants in local towns. And some worked, I would say ironically, as munition handlers in Tooele. Temporarily free of the camps, Japanese American workers had close and personal contact with residents of the interior West. With the remainder of my time, I would like to focus on how those interactions not only were shaped by the past, but how they challenged and in some cases changed the racial attitudes of people during a war when racial tension shaped the national discourse. So an analysis of the racial climate of the Mountain States requires some quick historical context. The wartime attitudes of Utahns, Idahoans, and Coloradans towards the people of Japanese descent were shaped over generations by numerous factors, including foreign immigration, labor competition, xenophobia, and scientific racism. A large number of new immigrants who entered the United States between 1860 and 1900, a group which the superintendent of the 1870 census referred to as beaten men from beaten races, were considered by many Americans to be racially inferior. This new wave of immigration stoked the fears of xenophobic ideologues and gave birth to nativist organizations that vociferously promoted immigration restrictions. Western nativists singled out the Chinese, and in 1882, Congress passed an Exclusion Act that effectively ended Chinese immigration for the next 60 years. The Japanese, who began arriving in the West Coast in significant numbers during the 1890s, quickly inherited the anti-Asian sentiment that had been focused on the Chinese. In a speech in 1900, San Francisco Mayor James Phelan asserted, "The Japanese are starting the same tide of immigration that we thought we had checked 20 years ago. The Chinese and Japanese are not bona fide citizens. They are not the stuff of which American citizens should be made." Apprehension over Japan's growing military power after 1905 morphed into economic and cultural realms, and over the course of the next 3 decades, journalists, novelists, nativist organizations, and influential politicians moved the yellow peril into the national consciousness. Newspapers such as the San Francisco Chronicle, taking their cues from labor activists and nativist groups, also launched a series of vitriolic propaganda campaigns against Japanese immigrants in 1905. Pseudoscientists, nativists, and novelists also perpetuated Asian stereotypes, and politicians and nativists such as James Phelan and V.S. McClatchy drew on stereotypes to help push through immigration reform and alien land laws. Echoing and perhaps even reinforcing the rhetoric of eugenicists and nativists, authors like H.G. Wells, Jack London, and J. Allen Dunn imagined and wrote about an impending war between Asians and the West. Stereotypes perpetuated in popular literature informed political discussions, arguing that the Japanese were the least assimilable and most dangerous to our country. Men like V.S. McClatchy ultimately convinced Congress to ban Japanese immigration in 1924. As Japan aggressively expanded its empire during the 1930s, critics portrayed the Nikkei as subversives, lying in wait to aid a Japanese invasion. Now, the residents of the interior West imbibed much of the racial stereotyping and discriminatory practices of their West Coast cohorts. In wartime letters and editorials, local citizens reiterated racialized notions that the Japanese were not capable of assimilation, expressed fear of the Asian horde or peril, and perpetuated platitudes about Japanese subversion. In many cases, these critics echoed General DeWitt in failing to distinguish between Japanese and Japanese American citizens. Writing to Utah Governor Herbert Ma in 1942, one man argued, quote, "The Japanese are not readily assimilated and mixed with those of other races who have come and whose ancestors have come to these United States. They are not capable of being anything other than clannish because of their racial characteristics." Miss M.C. Boyer of Ontario, Oregon, wrote to Oregon Governor Sprague, saying, "We of Ontario have had enough of the yellow plague here already, and I am sure that we don't want any more of them, no matter where they come from, for a Jap is a Jap, no matter where he or she was born." The Japanese people were not entirely foreign residents to the Mountain States before the war, but the sudden influx of tens of thousands of people of Japanese ancestry into the region strained relationships between the new immigrants and the local population. During the voluntary evacuation period, sensationalized reports of a mass influx of Japanese caused some residents to fear that the Nikkei were shock troops for a Japanese invasion. "Do you realize what is going to happen if you let 1,000 alien Japs into our state to settle down?" wrote one couple to the Colorado governor. Wives and mothers whose husbands and sons have gone on to fight will not feel safe to go to bed at night for fear that the Japanese are going to break into their homes. And attacks with intent to kill, rape, robbery. Young defenseless girls will be brought to shame and many times left murdered. Witnessing a Japanese family filling up gas in Provo, Robert Meekum wrote to Utah's governor. They were all gathered in a group and talking very earnestly, he noted. They were all alone to pass our power plants, our water supply. It would seem they could do a great deal of damage. If farmers in Utah are going to have them work here, housewives are going to be afraid to buy garden produce for farmers in case it may be poisoned. Now, the construction of large federally funded incarceration camps and the arrival of tens of thousands of dangerous Japanese, Topaz, by the way, became instantly the 5th largest city in Utah, only exacerbated those fears. If local residents saw danger in their new arrivals, local businessmen and entrepreneurs saw profit. Desperate for laborers, farmers throughout the Mountain States welcomed them with open arms. WRA Field Relocation Officer W.E. Rollins recalled, economic pressure for labor was unquestionably the dominant factor in promoting acceptance of Japanese Americans throughout the mountain area. A farmer threatened with partial or total loss of his crop for lack of labor to harvest it would usually swallow his prejudice, any prejudice that he might have had against Japanese American workers. Other businesses near the camps benefited from the overnight addition of thousands of new customers. Now, despite the potential economic benefit of having a camp nearby, however, local residents were not overly generous in their relationships with the incarcerees, at least not initially. Former incarcerees recalled that many businesses in Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Montana posted "No Japs Allowed" signs in their front windows. This is actually from Arizona, this particular photograph. Osaki Tanawaki, editor of the Grenada Pioneer, felt that while residents were tolerant of the Nikkei who visited from the camps, they were not entirely accepted. As the two mentioned cities, Lamar and Grenada, they are only of a financial relationship, he reported. Very little social contacts have been made, and we may state that socially, we are still strangers. For some, visiting the camps and interacting with the residents helped them confront their racial bias. Historian Sandra Taylor tells a story of a local civic group who toured Topaz and were later treated by the residents to some congenial entertainment. Afterward, quote, the visitors announced that whatever prejudice they held against the Japanese, they promised that they would inform others about the true nature of the camp. Taylor concluded, such a conversion to the evils of racial prejudice seems highly unlikely since values change slowly, but it certainly was a beginning. For people like General DeWitt, racial perceptions changed little during the war, but for some locals, interaction likely altered their preconceived notions over time. Farmers generally acknowledged how badly the Nikkei labor was needed and treated them fairly well. Some, however, expressed what I would describe as mixed feelings about some of the Nikkei workers. W.D. Porter, writing for Salt Lake City's Deseret News, described how some Utah farmers felt about their Nikkei employees. Reactions to the Japanese laborers vary in different counties. Some farmers swear by them, others swear at them. Of course, in communities here, the Japanese laborers struck a time or two for higher wages in processing plants and on farms, and there is an adverse feeling among the people. But in some communities and on farms where the Japanese laborers have cooperated and not taken advantage of their employers, there is a friendly feeling among the citizens. Residents of the Mountain States had what I would describe as a love-hate relationship with Japanese American laborers. Despite the fact that farmers pleaded with the Nikkei workers to come to their communities and businesses certainly appreciated the economic benefits of new customers, racial antagonism simmered in the hearts of many locals. This hostility was a product of both the past and the wartime present. Sometimes this enmity bubbled to the surface in the form of verbal abuse and discrimination, and sometimes, albeit in very rare cases, into outright violence. Industrial discrimination was one outgrowth of racism in the region. As was true for African Americans in the South, many businesses around the Mountain West refused to serve people of Japanese ancestry based solely on their race. Seasonal workers living in farm administration camps in Provo, Utah, reported that nearby restaurants would not sell to them and that some cinemas allowed them only to sit in segregated parts of the theater. Other workers were verbally harassed while walking down public streets, and some had rocks thrown at them as they walked. On storefronts in Hamilton, Montana, workers often encountered two familiar words printed on cards: no Japs. One worker lamented, "We did come here to do our bit for ultimate victory by harvesting beets for the vital sugar, but we were informed that our presence was not welcomed." Though most Nikkei laborers grew accustomed to hearing derogatory words directed at them, some decided to fight back. In December of 1942, for example, 4 beet laborers on leave from Poston got into a fight with the military police at Denver's Union Station. Though rare, physical intimidation sometimes escalated into arms. During the fall of 1943, for example, one of the more notorious episodes of violence occurred near the Farm Administration camp in Provo, Utah. Racial tensions were high in Utah at this time when a carload of rowdy youth drove up to the tent camp and began peppering the camp with gunshots. 3 people were injured, and 1 woman was shot in the leg. Frightened workers boycotted work the next day, sending a clear message to the community that they would not tolerate such violence. Knowing full well the critical contributions of the Nikkei workers to the local economy, prominent community leaders quickly condemned the actions of the men. Arrests were made promptly. This is the tent camp here. Arrests were made promptly, and citizens pledged to better protect the workers. Characterizing the event as an act of terrorism, the Salt Lake Tribune condemned these cowardly white miscreants who had emulated savages or Axis enemies by wantonly attacking helpless, unsuspecting, unarmed captives in the government's custody. This is just one example among many of violent hate crimes which occurred throughout the Mountain West from 1942 to 1944. Though long-standing racial prejudice contributed to these acts of violence, contemporary events, including myths about pampering and luxury in the incarceration camps, unfavorable press surrounding Japanese war crimes, and fears about the Japanese permanently settling in the West also shaped the way in which local communities treated Japanese American workers. Nikkei laborers struggled to come to terms with the contradictory messages they received from communities around the Rocky Mountain West. On one hand, businesses were desperate for their labor and publicly expressed gratitude for their help. Many local residents, on the other hand, drew the line at allowing the Nikkei to permanently settle in their communities. Mitz Koshiyama felt this contradiction. Koshiyama left Hart Mountain Confinement Center on numerous occasions to help desperate farmers in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Despite his hard labor, Koshiyama could not escape the feeling that local residents accepted the Nikkei only when it was economically expedient. The folks in Powell and Cody, he recalled, were, quote, very anti-Japanese except when they needed the help of the incarcerees. Businesses would put up "No Japs Allowed" signs in the towns, but when the town needed help to harvest their sugar beets and potatoes, they asked the camp authorities to have the evacuees help. Koshiyama continued, I think the evacuees did a tremendous job of going out there and helping them harvest their crops. But after the crops were finished, again, the poor evacuees were labeled Japs. The funniest thing, next year came around again, and when they needed help, we were the Japanese. We weren't Japs no more. In the end, many Westerners wanted the help of Japanese Americans, but not their long-term presence. This was and remains one of the sad ironies of the war. Despite difficult living and working conditions, rampant discrimination, and brief episodes of violence, as many as 20,000 Japanese Americans or people of Japanese ancestry left the incarceration camps to work. The fact that so many Nikkei did this is a testament to how desperate many of them were to, quote, get on the opposite side of barbed wire, to make a little extra money, or to offer patriotic service to the war effort. But another factor was probably involved. Not every worker had a uniformly bad experience. Though some Americans around the country as well as the mountain states were guilty of intolerance and racism, there were very many individuals who accepted the incarcerees into their communities. Bigotry and racism did not fade overnight, as I've said, but public attitudes towards Nikkei workers, and I would say Japanese Americans in general, did change slowly over the course of the war. This was in no small part due to the efforts of local civic and religious organizations and the heroic efforts of the Nisei, who served in the Pacific and European theaters, the bravery of whom was published quite extensively in national magazines like Life and Time in 1944. The diligent and profoundly important work of Nikkei laborers, however, was perhaps the most important factor in changing how many people in the region viewed Japanese Americans. In a letter to Carrie McWilliams in November of 1942, one laborer recounted a conversation he had recently had with an older woman in Utah. She told me of the attitude of the people here towards the coming of the Japanese workers, that some were definitely suspicious of us, afraid we might do harm and that we might be spies. She said that our coming and living in the same community has dispelled her fears, and now most of the community think very highly of us. One by one, in other words, Nikkei laborers transform the attitudes of local peoples. Farmers around the region publicly expressed their gratitude to the Nikkei workers in local newspapers, and some alluded to a fundamental change in racialized perceptions of Japanese Americans. Summarizing this sentiment, a January 1945 editorial in the Burley Herald read, "With each passing month, our respect for them has increased. The Japanese men and women who have worked in Burley have performed a great service. They have thinned, they have cultivated and harvested the beets, they have irrigated and picked up and sorted the potatoes, they have tended the sheep in the winter and herded the fattening beef in the summer. The Japanese labor was the best source for good, thorough, sustained work. We hope that many of the President residents will want to remain here to help us. We have come to understand and appreciate them, and we admit that we need them." Considering that Japanese Americans could have remained in the incarceration camps during the war, allowing the government that had removed them to take care of them, it's remarkable how many chose to leave the camps to work in surrounding communities. In doing so, they made a vital contribution to the war effort, but they also helped change how many people across the region viewed Japanese Americans. The persistence of violence throughout the war forcefully reminds us that racial attitudes did not change overnight, but statements like those mentioned previously indicate that they had begun to change. Like the soldiers of the 442nd who gave their lives fighting for American ideals abroad, Nikkei workers played an important role in influencing and changing racial stereotypes at home. The words of praise that President Harry Truman had for Japanese American soldiers could have easily been directed at the men and women who labored in the Mountain West. "You have fought not only the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you have won." They had not won completely, of course. Racial prejudice persisted in the Mountain West, and it did around the country after the war. For Japanese Americans in particular, it would be another 4 decades before the federal government would recognize and acknowledge the role that racism played in the decision to remove and confine the Nikkei en masse during World War II. In that way, the laborers who fought prejudice in the interior West won an important battle, but not the war. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, and just a quick reminder that there is lunch begins I think right after this session. I believe that there are talks beginning at 12 noon over in the Great Hall, so please do join us for the lunch. Yes?
Scotti, did you ever come across that Obata was Okibo's teacher at Berkeley?
No, I don't know about that specifically.
Because he was a professor at Berkeley, my understanding, before he was incarcerated.
Chirobata?
Yeah.
He was an assistant professor at Berkeley.
Right. So I was wondering if he had Okibo as a student there.
Okubo, yeah, they worked together.
Oh, Mine Okubo, excuse
yeah.
me.
Okubo, yeah.
No, I misunderstood what you
Yeah.
said. No, I didn't come across any indication of that. No.
The other side of that is that their son, I should say Obata's son, was, I think, a senior at Topaz High, went to Washington University in St. Louis to study architecture. He then became a very famous architect, but he was also able to have his parents come and live with him in St. Louis.
That was
Right.
after Chirobata had been beaten up in camp because of the problem with the loyalty questionnaire. So for his own safety, they took him to St. Louis.
But he eventually regained his professorship at UC
Yes.
Berkeley in
Yeah.
1953.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A firm, very famous national firm.
HOK.
HOK.
And they're redoing the Salt Lake Airport right now.
Yes, I had the opportunity to visit your art museum as part of the tour at the NHA conference back in June, and I was extremely impressed with the diversity and the quality of the paintings, and I was informed that a lot of that, because a lot of those people were from the San Francisco art community, a lot of them were. And my question is this. Are there additional paintings that you have in your collection that aren't on display, and will there be kind of a rotating, if so, will you be rotating the exhibits? Is that how that works?
Yeah, we
or-
probably won't rotate this exhibit, but when we open as a permanent museum, we have a gallery and we'll rotate those. Scotty, anything we have about 10 or maybe now we have closer to 15 paintings on oil paintings, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so it was unfortunate that we had had to limit at all, because it would be ideal to show everything. But the works on paper classification that we decided on meant that we couldn't display anything such as oils or silk painting. So
We have about 115 pieces in our collection.
Two things. Delta was familiar with Japanese Americans. My mom would have been a valedictorian had there not been a kid named Inabu. And there were a lot of valedictorians who were Japanese Americans at the high school. When I helped write the history of Millard County for the bicentennial, I generated some hostility among my own football teammates and classmates by being fair, treating Topaz. I was called names for doing that in the 1990s.
I had a question for Christian. The Japanese who were working on farms, there were Japanese farmers in Utah at the time.
Mhm.
Did they hire the Nikkei?
There are a couple of cases of that happening, but generally no. There was a little bit of a fear of associating Utah Japanese who were not incarcerated with those that were incarcerated from the West Coast. And so, yeah, you ran into that. They didn't want to mix the two, but there were some who did. There was a rather large farming community in Keatley, which is now underneath Jordanelle Dam. Was a gentleman who came out before the war during the voluntary evacuation period who brought out a fair number of Japanese Americans to live and farm there, and they hired a few people from the camps. And it did happen on occasion, but yeah, generally there was this desire to sort of separate the Utah Japanese community with those on the coast, for fear that they themselves would bring upon their own community disdain for doing that.
In fact, there was a letter from Ogden by a Japanese American man to the governor saying, we don't want the camp here. So it's complicated, and it's got lots and lots of contradictions.
What was the relationship to the camp directors and those that wanted to work outside? Did the Japanese feel that they were pressured to go work for the farmers, or did they look for an opportunity to get out of the camp to work for the farmers? How did that dynamics work?
It was a combination of both of those two things. Initially, they were very heavily recruited. You had sugar beet companies coming into the actual camps, recruiting, saying this is your patriotic duty to help the country. And again, terribly ironic, but there were many Japanese Americans who very genuinely felt like this was their opportunity to prove their loyalty. Now, we can look back at that and say they didn't need to prove anything, right, being incarcerated. But some of them took that very, very seriously and did not want to just languish in the camps. And I think that's an important note, is that they could have sat in the camps. And many of them worked in the camps. I didn't really point that out in my comments. They did all kinds of jobs, and they had farms on the camps as well. But many of them chose to leave for numerous factors. One is just to kind of get on the other side of barbed wire, to taste freedom again. And there were people that talked about, I'd love to have a hamburger. You can imagine eating the same bland food day after day after day. Something as small as getting a Coke, having an ice cream cone was incentive to leave. Others wanted higher labor or higher wages. Okay? As Jane alluded to, you could not make as much in the camps as you could outside. You could get prevailing wages. And the last factor that I saw was truly there were many who genuinely wanted to help the war effort. This was their attempt to do that. I applaud them for it. but they did. They left the camps for those reasons.
There are a couple questions back here.
I have a couple of questions. Why was this area chosen to begin with? That's one question. And then, do you have any idea of how many people at Topaz actually stayed in Utah after the war?
Jane can answer that. Yeah.
Well, the first question, there was a man named Robert Cousins that was sent out throughout the West to find places. And they looked at a place by McCormick. I don't know if you know where that is, but it was on the side of a hill, and they thought that they could dry farm. But really, if McCormick could dry farm, we would have been dry farming. So he rejected that place, and my dad wrote a little article in the newspaper saying that Delta had been rejected. And that sort of provoked a man in the town to go after the camp and say, we want it to come here. And then it was changed, so it's about maybe 30 miles away out into the northwest of Delta. Quite a few people did go to stay in Utah. One is Lorraine Krause's family. Yeah. So she's being real quiet over there.
And just to add to that, when I was in the National Archives several years ago doing research, I came across a file that had hundreds and hundreds of requests from communities around the West requesting that the government put the incarceration camps in their communities. They saw it as an economic benefit to their communities, this huge infusion of federal funds. And so the government went through a lengthy process of trying to distinguish which sites they wanted to choose. Often they were on federal land, although there are cases where they purchased private land, needed to be close to a water source, various other factors in addition to that. After the war, the Japanese American communities, a lot of them did not choose to go back to California, although many of them did. And over the course of the war, the government allowed people to go work back east. As long as they stayed out of the Western Defense Zone, they could stay in the Mountain West, although local communities were not particularly receptive to that idea. But the three largest communities after the war were Chicago, had the largest number of Japanese Americans, and it had a very vibrant Japanese American community. Denver, and then Salt Lake.
I have two questions.
We're almost out of time, but please do ask your question.
I think they're simple answers probably. First of all, did they have places where the workers would stay once they went into the sugar beet camps or whatever? The companies had a place for them to stay, and then they would just go back on the weekends to the camps? And then the other question was, how did they handle the food? Like you say, it was bland and not very flavorful. Mm-hmm. Was it the government that sent that there, and then they just had the general food?
Yeah, so the food was bland. It was not something that they were used to. It was not a typical Japanese diet, and it was unimaginative. It sustained them, but it was not great food initially. Over time, Japanese Americans themselves became cooks. They were able to get different ingredients that were a little bit better, and they were able to make food that was a little bit closer to what they liked. But still, overall, keep in mind that everybody was rationed during the war, most Americans, and so there were certain foods that just weren't available. What was the first part of your question again?
And then the camps.
Oh, where they stayed.
Yeah.
So it really varied. I've read hundreds and hundreds of accounts of people who left, and it just varied. Some people left for the day to camp, came back to camp at night. Some people left. The beet workers in particular usually lived on private farms. So the government would contract out, you would get a farm, you'd go there, they would have a shed, sometimes an outhouse, some place for them to live. The conditions were often very, very bad, especially in the first couple of years. As the war progressed and the government got a little bit more organized with these seasonal laborers, they created tent camps. And so the one I showed you here in Provo was a fairly large tent camp that had decent facilities and hot showers, things like that. And so they often utilized old CCC camps from the Great Depression and kind of converted those into temporary places.